Welcome to Records and Information Management Policies. At the high level, I should mention, we're not going to be talking about details or content in this presentation. That's for some other discussions. My name is Ken Oldenburger. I've been doing records classification consulting for about 28 years, and I've been doing policy development for about 14, 15 years of that. So let's talk about the first question. Do we need RIM policies? Especially if you're a small organization, do you really need them? It's pretty obvious that larger organizations do need them in order to keep control of their records management programs. Smaller organizations, you also need them. And there's a couple reasons why. First reason is, obviously, you need guidelines. You do need some instructions. And when I say guidelines, I mean policies, procedures, standards, instructions, forms, these things that give you guidelines around how to do things with regard to records management inside your organization. Guidelines are very, very important. One that we often don't think about, though, is accountability. Accountability in a records management program is a very important thing as well. As a matter of fact, you may have recognized accountability as being one of the 8 generally accepted record-keeping principles. And I personally think that it is probably the most important principle out of the 8. So when we talk about accountability, I kind of like the metaphor of a ladder. And the fact is that authority and responsibility comes from your highest decision-making body. Often I'm dealing with a board or a council, and so they're the ones who approve a lot of decisions that go on in the organization. So authority and responsibility comes from them. And records management authority and responsibility touches literally on every position in an organization that deals with records and information, all the way down to your knowledge or information workers. So that's not a difficult thing to imagine. It may be surprising to you that the board is actually responsible for records management, and so are every information worker. They have responsibility and authority to do things in a records management environment. The flip side of all of this, of course, is that there's compliance and reporting that goes back up the ladder. So information workers, knowledge workers, they give information, they're compliant to policies, and that goes back up the chain to the board. So there's this give and take up and down the ladder, which describes accountability. And it helps to think of the policies and procedures as rungs in that ladder. So the accountability, the authority, responsibility, compliance, reporting, they follow those rungs of policy. All right, let's get right into what we're talking about at a high level when we want to look at RIM policies. So the first option is number 1. And this was very popular in the mid-90s, especially in BC municipalities, that you would have a giant all-in board-approved policy. And it would look something like this. Just a big, huge collection of procedures and policy statements and standards, all put into one huge document. We're talking 50 to 60 pages, not including attachments, because quite often people would do things like attach their classification system to this thing on top of all of it. This is not a good approach. I never recommend doing it this way for a couple of reasons. First of all, trying to find something in there is difficult. It is not a very readable document. If you want to find one paragraph talking about mobile use, mobile device data, do you know where you're going to find it? The next thing is who's going to sit down and want to read a novella that is not all that exciting? It's policy language, so not the greatest bedtime reading. The second thing is, if you need to make an amendment to this document, you have to go to the board, which is the first challenge. The fact that you've got a 50 to 60 page document going in front of the board means that you might even hesitate to do an amendment, which is not good. You do want to keep your policies up to date. The next thing is, once it goes to the board, you might have a keener that starts reading through the entire thing and starts asking questions like, why are we doing it this way? And what does this mean? And how come this? Which may be going far beyond the auspices of your current amendment. So there's just a lot of negatives to having a giant all-in RIM policy. A far better option that I have found is, when you get to some organizations, having multiple reasonably sized policies. Yes, they might still have to go to the board for approval, but at least they're a bit more bite-sized. Probably the largest one would be what I call the foundational or the framework policy, usually the first policy that kind of explains what we're talking about with records and information management or information governance, if you're going all that direction. It introduces things like the principles, and it also has a glossary, and the glossary can be quite extensive because we do still use quite a bit of jargon and codes in our industry. So these need to be explained as they relate to other policies and documents. So the foundational or framework policy can get somewhat large, like 8 pages, maybe 9, and also include related documentation like legislation, standards, that sort of thing. All right. The other following policies are generally much shorter, and some can be just a couple of pages. So I say 5 to 15 policies. I usually have 5 basic policies that I recommend, but if you have a very eager and forward-thinking board or RIM program, you might get up to 15 policies. As long as they're focused and bite-sized, that's fine. It is still a challenge, though, that these are board approved. So when you do an amendment, you do still need to go to the board to get that amendment approved. Fortunately, like I said, these are more bite-sized. It helps your board to focus, keep them on track. I generally recommend this kind of approach for medium to large entities. By medium, I mean kind of about 8 departments or larger, maybe 500 information workers or larger, somewhere around there. The reason why I don't mind this happening for these types of organizations is because the board is generally familiar with the concepts of policies and approving them and amending them, and they don't go down rabbit holes and get distracted and things like that. So it's not a bad approach for these kinds of organizations. Smaller ones, it gets much more difficult, though. And that's why when we start getting into smaller ones, I tend to recommend options either 3A or 3B. So 3A is where we have the board or council approving one small, simple RIM policy. So it's a board or council RIM policy. And that essentially assigns authority for the entire RIM program to a position, hopefully to a RIM manager. If you don't have a RIM manager, then it may be the CAO, it may be the CEO, something like that. But it assigns responsibility. So basically it says, we establish a program, you might say what the program includes, what kind of documents, like a classification system, policies and procedures, training, this sort of stuff. And then saying this position is responsible for maintaining that program. Okay. So it authorizes. Remember that ladder? That's why I got the ladder here. That's the first rung in that ladder going down. Then you have a RIM manager, and that RIM manager develops and approves and amends the corporate RIM policies. So the top one is just a board RIM policy. The ones that the RIM manager does, those are corporate RIM policies. And so because you have one individual in charge of those overarching policies, it's much, much easier to keep your RIM program on track and to update these policies and procedures as time goes on. And then, of course, those corporate RIM policies give authority and responsibility to the departments, to other RIM staff, to the knowledge workers, that sort of thing. You might even see another level below this where the departments have some procedures. So document specific procedures that they have created in order to manage a specific workflow around a document. All right. I like this approach, but there's actually another approach that may be even better. It's exactly the same. We start out the same, where the board or the council or whoever does a board RIM policy, short and simple, which assigns responsibility and authority to a RIM manager or whichever position. And then that RIM manager is in charge of the RIM program, a large portion of which is the RIM manual. So the RIM manual is an excellent concept that's reinforced by the Canadian standard CGSB 72.34. And in this case, the policies, the procedures, even the glossary, the framework concepts can be embedded within a corporate RIM manual. This is a living, growing document. So one of the attachments would be your classification system. One of the attachments would be the original board level RIM policy. And it would lay out what are knowledge workers responsible to do, what are RIM staff responsible to do, what are departments responsible to do. And again, departments can add in their own workflows as a portion, an article, or a page in this RIM manual. I find this corporate RIM manual concept to be very, very flexible. And for that reason, I find it very, very helpful for smaller organizations. And smaller organizations, I tend to define between 0 and 100 information workers. All right. That is kind of the high level concepts that I wanted to introduce in this presentation. So thank you very much. If you have questions, feel free to contact me, and take care. Thank you.